753 years before the birth of Christ, according to ancient Roman tradition, a man named Romulus drew a line in the dirt and called it a city. Anyone who crossed that line uninvited, including his own twin brother Remus, would die for the transgression. And so the first act of Roman governance was, in fact, an execution. That is the kind of origin story that tells you everything you need to know about what Rome would become. We are talking about a civilization that began as a collection of mud huts on a river bend in central Italy and ended up controlling an empire stretching from the deserts of North Africa to the highlands of Scotland. But before the legions, before the emperors, before the Colosseum and the aqueducts and the roads that still run beneath European cities today, there was something far more chaotic and far more interesting. There was the beginning. And the beginning, as it turns out, was messy. The site that would become Rome sits on the Tiber River in what is now central Italy, roughly 15 miles from the coast. The river was not incidental to the story. It was the story. The Tiber provided fresh water, a natural defensive barrier, and access to trade routes that connected the interior of the Italian peninsula to the Mediterranean Sea. The Latin tribes who settled the 7 hills surrounding this stretch of the river in the early 1st millennium BCE were not building an empire. They were trying to survive the winter. The hills offered protection from flooding and from the raids of neighboring tribes, particularly the Etruscans to the north and the Sabines to the northeast. These were not glamorous people living glamorous lives. They were farmers and herders scratching an existence out of volcanic soil, building homes from timber and thatch, and worshiping gods they believed lived in the rivers and the trees and the storms. The traditional founding date of Rome is 753 BCE, though modern archaeology tells a more complicated story. Excavations on the Palatine Hill, one of the famous 7 hills, have uncovered evidence of human habitation dating back to at least 1000 BCE. Suggesting that the city did not spring fully formed from the imagination of one legendary founder, but grew slowly and organically over centuries of settlement. But Romans themselves were not interested in the complicated archaeological truth. They preferred Romulus, and honestly, who can blame them? The legend of Romulus and Remus is one of the most enduring origin myths in all of human history, and it earns that status by being genuinely extraordinary. The twins were said to be the sons of Mars, the god of war, and a Vestal virgin named Rhea Silvia, which raises obvious theological complications that ancient Romans apparently decided not to examine too closely. Rhea Silvia's uncle, a king named Julius who had seized power from her father, ordered the infants thrown into the Tiber to drown. The servants tasked with this grim errand instead set the boys adrift in a basket, which washed ashore at the foot of the Palatine Hill. There, a she-wolf nursed them until a shepherd named Faustulus found them and raised them as his own. The image of the she-wolf suckling the twins became the defining symbol of Rome, reproduced on coins, sculptures, and monuments for more than 1,000 years. You can still see it today in museums across Italy. When the brothers grew to manhood, they overthrew Amulius, restored their grandfather to his throne, and then set out to found a city of their own. The dispute over which hill to build on, settled by an augury of birds, ended with Romulus claiming the Palatine and drawing that famous boundary line. Remus mocked the shallow ditch his brother called a wall by leaping over it. Romulus killed him. The city was named Rome, after its founder, and Romulus became its first king. Now, historians are careful to distinguish between the legendary Romulus and the historical reality of early Rome, and rightly so. But what the legend does capture accurately is the violent, competitive, and deeply hierarchical nature of Roman political culture from its very inception. Power in early Rome was not inherited peacefully. It was seized, defended, and often paid for in blood. That pattern would repeat itself with remarkable consistency for the next 1,000 years. After Romulus, Roman tradition holds that 6 more kings ruled the city before the monarchy was abolished. These were Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and finally Tarquinius Superbus, whose name translates with devastating accuracy as Tarquin the Proud. Each king left a distinct mark on the growing city. Numa Pompilius, who ruled from approximately 715 to 673 BCE, is credited with establishing Rome's religious institutions, its calendar, and its priestly colleges. He was, by ancient accounts, a peaceful and pious ruler, which made him something of an anomaly in Roman history. Tullus Hostilius, his successor, compensated for this by being aggressively warlike, destroying the Latin city of Alba Longa and incorporating its population into Rome, significantly expanding the city's territory and its labor force. Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king, was an Etruscan by origin, which tells us something important about early Rome. The city was not ethnically homogeneous. It was a meeting point of Latin, Sabine, and Etruscan cultures, and this mixing of peoples and traditions gave Roman civilization much of its early dynamism. The Etruscans in particular contributed enormously to Roman culture, including architectural techniques, religious practices, and the toga, that garment which would become the defining symbol of Roman civic identity. Tarquinius Priscus is credited with beginning construction of the Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing venue that could eventually hold up to 250,000 spectators, and with commissioning the first drainage system for the marshy valley between the hills, a project that would eventually become the Cloaca Maxima, one of the ancient world's most impressive engineering achievements and, remarkably, still partially functional today. But it was the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, who brought the monarchy to its end. Tarquinius Superbus did not merely lose his throne. He was driven from it in an act of collective fury that Romans would commemorate for centuries as the founding moment of their liberty. In 509 BCE, his son Sextus Tarquinius committed the rape of Lucretia, a noblewoman of impeccable reputation whose subsequent suicide ignited a political firestorm that the Roman aristocracy had been waiting to light for years. The nobleman Lucius Junius Brutus, a man who had spent years feigning stupidity to survive at court, suddenly revealed himself as one of the sharpest political minds in Rome. He rallied the patrician class, expelled the royal family, and abolished the monarchy entirely. In its place, Romans established something genuinely revolutionary for the ancient world, a republic governed by two elected consuls who served one-year terms, checked each other's power, and could be held accountable by the Senate. The word they used for what Tarquin had exercised was dominatio, meaning the rule of a master over slaves. Romans would invoke that word as a curse for the next 5 centuries. The republic that emerged from this upheaval was not a democracy in any modern sense. Power resided firmly with the patrician class, the old noble families who monopolized the Senate, the priesthoods, and the magistracies. The plebeians, who constituted the vast majority of Rome's population, were for generations excluded from meaningful political participation. But the republic was dynamic in a way that monarchies rarely are, because its internal contradictions generated constant pressure for reform. Over the course of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, plebeians fought a prolonged and largely nonviolent struggle known as the Conflict of the Orders, winning the right to hold the consulship in 367 BCE, access to the major priesthoods, and ultimately the codification of Roman law in the 12 Tables, which were publicly displayed in the Forum so that no magistrate could arbitrarily reinterpret the rules to suit his own interests. It was an imperfect system, deeply tilted toward the wealthy, but it was a system with written rules, and that distinction mattered enormously. What truly transformed Rome from a regional city-state into a Mediterranean superpower was its extraordinary capacity for military expansion combined with a surprisingly pragmatic approach to citizenship. Unlike most ancient empires, Rome frequently extended citizenship or Latin rights to conquered peoples, binding them to Roman interests rather than simply extracting tribute from resentful subjects. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had consolidated control over the Italian peninsula through a combination of military conquest and strategic alliance, creating a network of Latin colonies and allied communities that could supply soldiers, resources, and loyalty on a scale no single city-state could match alone. Then came Carthage, and everything changed in scale. The Punic Wars, fought between 264 and 146 BCE, were not merely a series of military conflicts. They were an existential test of Roman civilization, and the second of the 3 wars came closer to destroying Rome than anything before or since. Carthage, the great Phoenician trading empire centered in what is now Tunisia, controlled the western Mediterranean with a naval power and commercial network that dwarfed anything Rome had yet built. The First Punic War, fought primarily over Sicily between 264 and 241 BCE, forced Rome to build a navy essentially from scratch, reportedly using a captured Carthaginian warship as a template. Rome lost hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men, not primarily to enemy action but to storms, because Roman sailors were simply not yet competent at open sea navigation. They persisted anyway, and eventually won, stripping Carthage of Sicily and forcing the payment of a massive indemnity. But it was the Second Punic War, beginning in 218 BCE, that produced one of history's most audacious military campaigns and one of Rome's most catastrophic defeats. The Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca, a man who had reportedly sworn an oath of eternal enmity toward Rome at the age of 9, marched an army of roughly 37,000 men and 37 war elephants from Spain, across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul, and over the Alps in winter. The crossing alone killed perhaps half his force and most of the elephants. What arrived in northern Italy was a battered, frostbitten army that had no business winning anything. And yet Hannibal proceeded to inflict three of the most devastating defeats in Roman military history. At the Trebia River in 218 BCE, at Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, and most catastrophically at Cannae in 216 BCE, where in a single afternoon Hannibal encircled and annihilated a Roman army of approximately 70,000 men. Hannibal demonstrated a tactical genius that military academies still study today. The ground at Cannae was reportedly so thick with Roman dead that survivors could not walk without stepping on bodies. Rome lost more men in that single battle than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. And yet Rome did not surrender. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact about the Republic at its height. The Senate refused to negotiate. They raised new legions from the very old men and boys who remained. They freed slaves and armed them. They sent Scipio Africanus to Spain to cut off Hannibal's supply lines, and ultimately to Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy, where he had roamed undefeated for 15 years without ever quite managing to deliver the killing blow. At Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal in open battle, ending the war and reducing Carthage to a client state. The Third Punic War, beginning in 149 BCE, ended with Rome besieging Carthage for 3 years and then burning it to the ground, salting the earth in an act of total destruction so complete that the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, became synonymous with the Roman capacity for absolute, unrelenting vengeance. But victory at that scale carries its own poisons. The conquest of the Mediterranean world flooded Rome with slaves, with plunder, and with a concentration of land in the hands of the wealthy that systematically destroyed the small farming class that had been the backbone of the Roman legions. The poison that destroyed Rome did not come from outside its walls. It had been brewing inside them for centuries, distilled from the very wealth and power that conquest had delivered. The land crisis that Hannibal's wars accelerated produced two brothers who tried to fix it and paid with their lives. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune in 133 BCE, proposed redistributing public land that wealthy aristocrats had illegally occupied for generations. The Senate, composed largely of the men whose land he intended to redistribute, had him beaten to death in the street along with 300 of his supporters, the first political murder in Roman history, and a threshold that, once crossed, proved impossible to uncross. His brother Gaius attempted similar reforms a decade later and died the same way, either killed by political enemies or, depending on the source, by his own hand. The message the Senate sent was unambiguous. The rules of the Republic applied to everyone except the people who wrote them. What followed was a century of escalating violence that the Romans themselves called the crisis of the late Republic. Generals discovered that personal armies loyal to their commander rather than to the state were the ultimate political tool. Marius reformed the legions in 107 BCE, creating professional soldiers who served for pay and looked to their general for land grants upon discharge, soldiers who would follow that general anywhere, including against Rome itself. Sulla proved the point in 88 BCE when he marched his legions into the city of Rome, the first Roman general to do so, and used military force to settle a political dispute. He then did it again in 83 BCE. The precedent was now established in blood and iron. If you had the legions, you had the power. Julius Caesar did not invent this system. He simply perfected it. After a decade of conquest in Gaul from 58 to 50 BCE, during which his campaigns killed an estimated 1 million people and enslaved another million, Caesar had the most battle-hardened army in the Roman world and the personal loyalty of every man in it. When the Senate ordered him to disband his forces in 49 BCE, he crossed the Rubicon River, the legal boundary beyond which no Roman general was permitted to lead troops, with the words that have echoed through history ever since. The die was cast. Civil war followed, Caesar won, and on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, 23 senators stabbed him to death on the floor of the theater of Pompey in what they believed was an act of republican salvation. It was, in fact, the last gasp of a republic that had already ceased to function. Caesar's heir, the young Octavian, spent the next 13 years eliminating every rival and then, in 27 BCE, accepted from a grateful Senate the title of Augustus, the revered one, becoming in everything but named the first emperor of Rome. The Pax Romana that Augustus inaugurated lasted roughly 2 centuries, and by any measurable standard it was among the most prosperous and stable periods in human history. Trade flowed from Britain to Mesopotamia along roads so well engineered that some of them are still in use today. The population of the empire reached perhaps 70 million people. Aqueducts delivered clean water to cities across 3 continents. And then the emperors happened. The Julio-Claudian dynasty that followed Augustus produced a lineup of rulers that reads less like a succession of heads of state and more like a case study in what absolute power does to human psychology. Tiberius retreated to the island of Capri and governed the empire through letters while allegedly indulging appetites that ancient sources describe in terms that remain shocking 2,000 years later. Caligula, who succeeded him in 37 CE, began his reign with such apparent promise that the Roman people celebrated in the streets, and within 4 years had reportedly appointed his horse to the consulship, declared himself a living god, and was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard in 41 CE. Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 CE, had his own mother murdered, kicked his pregnant wife to death, and presided over the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. A fire he almost certainly did not start, despite what the legend says, but which he exploited to build himself a palace so vast it contained an artificial lake where the Colosseum now stands. He too was eventually abandoned by the guard and died by his own hand, reportedly saying, "What an artist dies in me." The 5 good emperors who followed, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, represented Rome at its administrative and philosophical peak. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180 CE, was a Stoic philosopher who wrote his private meditations during military campaigns on the Danube frontier, producing a document of such clarity and moral seriousness that it remains in print today and is read by everyone from military officers to Silicon Valley executives. He was also the last emperor before the system began to come apart in ways that no philosophy could repair. What historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, spanning from 235 to 284 CE, saw Rome cycle through 50 emperors in roughly 50 years. The average reign lasted about 2 years. Most emperors died violently. The economy contracted, plagues swept through the empire repeatedly, and the frontiers buckled under pressure from Germanic tribes in the north and the resurgent Persian Empire in the east. The empire briefly fractured into 3 separate states simultaneously. It was, by any reasonable assessment, the end. And yet it did not end. Diocletian, who seized power in 284 CE, stabilized the empire through administrative genius and sheer force of will, dividing it into eastern and western halves for more efficient governance and restructuring the tax system and the military. His successor Constantine went further. In 313 CE, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance throughout the empire, and then did something that no one who knew Rome in the age of Augustus could have predicted. He converted to Christianity. The faith that Rome had intermittently persecuted for 3 centuries became the official religion of the empire, and the world has never been the same since.